Welcome to our viewers. Thank you for joining us today for our Ransomware Are You Prepared virtual tech and takeout event. Joining us today is Amit Ralani, the Director of Solutions Marketing for Cloudian, and Michael Baker, Managing Director at Mosaic451. And with that, I'll hand it over to Michael.
Hello, this is Mike Baker. I'm with a company called Mosaic451, and we are a cybersecurity services company. And what we do in the information security hierarchy is we started off as a SOC. We started off as a security operations center. And so we grew up in organizations surrounded by very expensive hardware, very expensive appliances, lots and lots of process, very heavy into the national government space. And we tend to do work for critical infrastructure and global organizations. To the topic at hand, with COVID-19 and with the world that we see in front of us today, critical infrastructure and governments are getting absolutely hammered by ransomware, and so ransomware is the mafia end of the attacks against the infrastructure. Things like watering holes and advanced persistent threat is the state actor end. You're seeing both state actors and criminal actors just attacking United States infrastructure today. So our place in the world is we run risk programs which correlate cybersecurity and data security activities with dollars. We do compliance and governance work, mostly NIST-based for United States governments, municipal, state, local. And then we do incident response and all of the automation orchestration that comes with that. So we're going to go back to the city named here. This is one that you've all heard of. We may actually have someone from here on the phone. This is what happens when you leave your ransomware recovery to hope versus you have a program in place to counter it. And so when the city of Atlanta got hit with ransomware year before last, the first thing that they did is it came after the city's domain controllers. The second thing it did is it came after the city's backups. Once the attackers got in, which was through a poorly secured program on the internet, I believe it was for firefighters' time reporting, they moved laterally and they hit the most important parts of the network first. So literally within minutes, the city could not recover. That unleashed a cascade that's still going to this day. There's another piece of a major American infrastructure that had the same attack hit it. Same attack, actually very similar vulnerability. But because we had practice, because we had operational discipline and visibility, literally the operations team caught it within 5 minutes. It was off the network within 7 minutes. And it literally wasn't even reported as a material event. It was only after Atlanta had gotten hit that we went back and realized that, you know, this big chunk of infrastructure got hit with the same attack by the same actors. We just caught it on the bounce. And this goes into, with a ransomware, where do I want to be? If somebody comes and my information has been locked up, I'm already at the worst part of the kill chain. I am already at collection, exfiltration, and exploitation. And the idea here is a well-run, well-disciplined cybersecurity operations program should be able to stop the attack somewhere in the middle. So reconnaissance is people scanning your network. The initial hack is how somebody gets in. Persistence is how do I establish a toehold in your network and move around? Installation of tools, moving laterally. And so the goal of the kill chain is to stop it as early as possible. This is an axiom in cybersecurity. And the thing that's interesting about the product that we're talking about today is that product assumes that every link in this chain has failed. That we didn't stop every shot, and somebody got through. And all of a sudden you see the red screen, and you know what it means. And it means that every one of your systemic defenses and processes let that single bullet through. So ransomware is spiking. Like I said earlier, it is an incredibly frisky time for state actors and criminal actors targeting the United States. Last year alone, and this is disclosed numbers, I know of several events here that were never disclosed. You know, healthcare, you're looking at 800 some odd. State and municipal governments, including the courts in Philadelphia, for example, were among the 113 disclosed. I suspect that number is extremely low. And then colleges, universities, school districts goes from professional ransomware all the way down to what's become the equivalent of a kid pulling a fire alarm to get out of a test. People have called in DOS attacks to their schools as a modern equivalent to pulling the fire alarm. So you come in, you see this, what now? Really what's happened is you just become one of what everybody else is facing. Ransomware just 2 days ago hit the largest utility in Portugal, which is a company called EDP. They're holding it for ransom for 10 million euros. The standard FBI playbook, when the FBI walks into a site and it's been locked up, is, can you pay the ransom? One, do you have backups? And the answer is usually no. And then if no backups, the only way to get that information back is going to be to pay the ransom. There's not much left to do. And so you're seeing it spike. You know, we've got some Sophos numbers here that are obviously a little bit self-serving to Sophos because they want you to buy their product. But the idea that this is growing exponentially, that ransomware is more and more present, and you see this with the counties in Florida, you see this with small cities in the state of Arizona, you see this with sheriff's departments in Texas. All of a sudden you're locked out of your own environment, and that is happening more and more rapidly. So we've spent a lot of time and treasure over the years as cybersecurity professionals buying a bunch of stuff, hoping that technology was going to make it all okay. And the problem with that methodology, which is defense in depth, can I arrange a defensive infrastructure that protects me from unauthorized access or disruption? And the problem is out of 10,000 shots, if you deflect all of them but one, you still lose. And so where ransomware protection fails, where the traditional mechanisms of cybersecurity fail, are when something gets through. Somebody hits the right social engineering tactic. There's a new malware phishing attempt that works. Somebody goes to a watering hole. Well, I've got firewalls. Won't they protect me? Well, guess what? Firewalls are open on port 443. Secure web traffic gets through. They're designed to let it through. So for a lot of attacks on an infrastructure, firewall is well valuable. Still let the bad guys in the front door. Managed backups generally, and this is where people go to tape. They have services. They do things. How long has the bad guy been in our infrastructure? Where was the initial breach? How do we know we're backing up to the right date? Can we back up at all? And this goes to just disaster recovery generally. As IT professionals, if we're not doing enterprise disaster recovery, we don't have enterprise disaster recovery. If we're not doing incident response actively, we don't have incident response. And the same goes for backups. If in your incident response protocols and your disaster recovery protocols, if you don't know how to lay hands on a clean image and reinstantiate it quickly, it's not going to work when you need it. So with Atlanta, with some of these other guys, backup was the second thing that got popped. And that includes a lot of other kinds of data as well. There was hundreds and hundreds of hours of police video. There was stuff from the courts. The courts, they didn't know how to charge for water. So all of a sudden, the city water customers were being billed by hand. And how do I take this infrastructure and reinstantiate it in a way that makes sense? And what typically happens is you call the FBI, they show up, they say pay the ransom. You call your biggest vendor, so Cisco or Microsoft show up, and they try to figure out who's in charge. Then all of your teams and all of the technical teams want to jump in and help because everybody wants to help in a crisis. And then the mayor comes in or the governor comes in and decides that there's a big company that does incident response in the state that we should be using instead. So a new group of people come in. And by now the FBI has left. By now Cisco and Microsoft have left. By now you're on 3 or 4 flavors of incident responders. And all that's happening is you're spending more and more money on something that your ounce of prevention could have saved. So this is the exception state in cybersecurity. All of the things that we learned about defense in depth, all of the money and the time that we've spent to become expert in these systems is awesome, and it's time well spent, and we should use those systems as professionals. But if we ever wake up one day and we're locked out of our systems, the only way that we can cleanly, effectively, and securely back up to a known clean state is what Amit's about to talk to right now. Amit?
That was awesome, Mike. Thank you so much for that explanation, guys. And thank you for that insightful overview of how the ransomware actually attacks, and with a live example, how you actually get over these kind of situations. So folks, this is Amit Raplani. I learned a lot today based on whatever I heard from Mike, and what I'm going to talk to you guys about is what Forrester has claimed as one of the key pillars to avoiding getting locked out of your own data in the event that you're hit with ransomware. Mike alluded to it a little bit, but it's based on an immutable file system as well as WORM storage, which makes the system watertight from a ransomware protection perspective. With that, please meet Cloudian HyperStore. Quick introduction of Cloudian HyperStore. HyperStore is Cloudian's flagship product. It's an on-prem S3 compatible object storage system. Now, most of you have heard of AWS S3. So AWS S3 is Amazon's product for storage based on S3 APIs. Now, these S3 APIs are open, and Cloudian is natively built on the same API infrastructure so that you can have the same storage that AWS offers in public cloud on-prem. It's completely compatible to all S3 workloads, and it is behind your firewall under your secure control. The core capabilities of HyperStore are in the storage of unstructured data all the way into the exabyte scales. Customers can start as small as a 3-node cluster in the 100 terabyte range all the way up to hundreds of petabytes. We actually have customers using HyperStore in the 200 plus petabyte range. HyperStore supports all the major clouds and is a perfect tool for hybrid cloud solutions. It is deployed as a software-only device. It is a software-defined storage solution, but we also have our own appliance, and we also have a pure consumption model where you can be charged by usage based on how you use the software. And finally, from a use case perspective, data protection is the main use case for Cloudian HyperStore. We will go into details of how we do data backups as well as ransomware protection use cases with Cloudian, but also we have archives, disaster recoveries, and the likes on data protection umbrella. We also have major customer base in the media and entertainment space, security and surveillance. We have multiple sheriff's departments using Cloudian for the backup of their body cams, as well as cities and counties using Cloudian for backup of their video footage from CCTVs, as well as other transportation-related video feeds. And finally, Internet of Things is another big use case for us. So, from a ransomware perspective, data protection is the bigger umbrella for ransomware. This actually comes into place when, as Mike mentioned, you have a bad actor that's already in your system. How are you going to protect your data? Well, the most basic way of doing this is backup. Now, Cloudian is compatible with all the popular backup solutions out there. Any backup solution that supports the S3 API will work with Cloudian as the capacity tier. What I've put up here is the most popular ones that our customers use. We work very closely with Veeam, Rubrik, Veritas, as well as Commvault, where they initiate the backup, and Cloudian is the backup target for these applications based on the S3 protocol. We also support disaster recovery with a remote site or in the public cloud, since we are built on the same protocol that's used in the public cloud. Any application that is written for Cloudian based on the S3 APIs will work with the public cloud vendors as well. In addition, we've heard now that at least the sophisticated hackers and the sophisticated players know that backup is your way of getting out of ransomware attacks. And these days, the first or the second target that gets hacked is your backup data. It's pretty simple from there. It's a cryptographic attack. You will have encryption placed on your backups, and it's made useless where it resides. Even if you have access to the backups, it's encrypted or in some cases deleted. And if it is encrypted, the key is usually stored outside of your system. So unless you pay the ransom, which is usually in Bitcoins, you cannot get access to it. For that, Cloudian actually offers the de facto WORM standards, which is based on S3 object lock. Now, this is something that Cloudian followed AWS S3 on. Now, AWS introduced object lock about 6 to 8 months back, and Cloudian introduced this within their feature sets in December of 2019. What it does is, this is a way of making your S3 object that reside in the Cloudian buckets completely immutable. This is this is becoming the standardized form of doing WORM, which is write once, read many for S3 objects in the industry. Now, the buckets and objects under the WORM control are completely locked up, and any data that resides in these is made tamper-proof and cannot be encrypted or deleted, even in the circumstance of an attack. That's one of the key things that even Forrester talked about is required to enable a ransomware attack protection mechanism. With S3 object locks, you do also get retention management controls, which means you can specify the amount of time for which your data is locked. Now, in most cases, when you're locking up data to protect it against ransomware, you typically do not want your data to be locked up in perpetuity. Maybe once the data ages out to 1 year, 2 years, you are okay to, from a management perspective, delete the data to make space for newer data that comes in. So in that case, you do not want the data to be locked up in perpetuity. And with the retention management controls, you can specify the amount of time for which the data is locked. Once the retention time elapses, the data becomes unlocked, and you can actually go in and clear out the data, making space for newer data, or you can leave it as it is because you probably are okay with the newer data under lock and key. There are two modes of protection that Cloudian offers with S3 Object Lock. So there's the governance mode, which is intended for data protection, and it does protect against account compromises and rogue actors, but it does have the provision to allow administrators to go in and actually clear out the data if or clear out the log in case of an accidental locking. Now, this mode is not necessarily the right one for ransomware protection. This is more from a perspective of internal departmental data protection from one department to the other, where you have multiple users using the same infrastructure and so on and so forth. And then there is the compliance mode. Now, this is intended for compliance, and it's the right mode to use for ransomware protection as well. In this mode, deletes are completely disallowed, even for root accounts. So even if you have a bad actor getting into your system and somehow hacking into the passwords and getting root access, they will not be allowed to delete or encrypt or change the data in any way, shape, or form. This is the one that this is the typical example for where you would lock the data for intentions for the ransomware protection purpose. Next one is, but it's not enough to just have an object lock feature to make the system completely immutable. You will hear some of the other storage vendors talking about S3 object lock, but what happens in the case where the bad actor actually gets into the OS level of the storage software and is able to actually manipulate storage at that level? Well, if your entire storage system is compromised, then an S3 object lock at a specific bucket is not going to help you prevent encryption of the data. We actually have specific regulatory requirements from SEC, FINRA, and CFTC that define what worm-enabled storage actually means. And with Cloudian, we've worked for the last 18 months to be certified on these very, very stringent regulations in the US as well as in EMEA to get actual worm certification. These certifications actually specify that even a root access at the system level will not be able to delete your storage system or your data when you're shipping this in the worm mode. In fact, with Cloudian, we also offer more secure features like secure shell, integrated firewall, IAM access controls. All of these are pre-integrated when you get Cloudian with worm enabled. Now, worm enablement for Cloudian actually comes with an extra license. It's not so much for the license cost, but more so that you are aware of what you're doing when you're locking up your data within Cloudian. This is serious data immutability, and it's really meant for protecting against these bad actor cases. Okay. So how does the protection actually work? Here's a very, very high level overview of how it works. You have your backup application, any of the backup applications, initiating the backup. Cloudian acts as the S3-based target for any of these vendors. What you have to do is you have to enable object lock on a Cloudian bucket beforehand, and there's an exception with Veeam, and I'll get to that in a bit. But with any of the other vendors, you have to initiate object locking on the Cloudian bucket and make that bucket as the target for the backup application. Once the backup actually starts, the workflow starts filling up that bucket. The bucket is already immutable, so the data that resides in that bucket is completely tamper-proof. Now, if you have a bad actor that gets into the system, they cannot change this bucket or the data inside the bucket. And even if you're attacked, you can quickly figure out where the vulnerability is, close it, and restore a clean copy from your bucket. Let's quickly see how this data immutability works in action. By this, what I mean is we actually have the solution working in our lab and with a few customers already. Even though this is a relatively new feature, we've had so much success with some of our customers that this is already deployed solution with some of our customers, right? So the immutability with Cloudian, as we just mentioned, works with any of these backup vendors. The only difference here is with Veeam. Now, the reason why I point out Veeam is that Veeam, in their version 10, which was released in February, a couple of months after Cloudian released their object lock feature, Veeam V10 added native support for S3 object lock. What that means is now the solution of Veeam and Cloudian works seamlessly, and it is actually an automated workflow for a backup which is completely immutable. We'll walk through an example right now based on our Veeam Cloudian setup. It is similar in every backup application case. It will work. The only difference is you will not be able to set the policies for the retention directly from the application like you would be able to do in Veeam. So here's how you would go ahead to implement an immutability feature within the backup workflow. In this case, it starts by configuring the backup repository from the backup application. In most cases, you would go into Cloudian and create an immutable bucket and make that as a target for the backup application. In the case of Veeam, you can directly create a bucket for the backup from the Veeam application and make it immutable. Here you see Cloudian being added as a scale-out backup repository to Veeam. Veeam actually supports a copy mode, so the data can be immediately copied onto Cloudian without having to stick around in the primary storage for a while. Any older data is completely moved onto Cloudian anyways based on policy. The connection between the backup application and Cloudian is always encrypted, so the data in flight is already secured in that sense. Here we see the immutability configuration from the Veeam console. Now, here this is where Veeam is a little ahead of the others from a standardization perspective. You actually are able to go into Veeam and with just a checkbox say that you want to make this particular backup immutable, and that's highlighted over here with a checkbox. Along with the checkbox, you also have a dialog box where you can click the number of days you want to make this particular backup immutable. You can go as low as a few days to all the way into years to make the backup chain immutable completely. And for others, this particular configuration, as I've mentioned, has to be done directly on Cloudian. Whatever you do on the Veeam dialog box is automatically inherited into Cloudian, and the data is made immutable for the policy set over here. Next, we see what happens in the case of an attack. In the case there is an insider attack in this case, and somebody is trying to delete the data that resides in the Cloudian bucket, basically the backup bucket. What you will see in this case is you will see that the backup delete failed, even if it is coming directly from a Veeam command. Any privileged user will also not be able to delete this backup, and your backup is protected. This is the same thing that would happen if you have a rogue actor come in and try to delete or encrypt your data that resides in this mode. And then finally, here's a little bit of a visualization, visualized example of what happens to your data when you have immutability enabled for, in this case, we've taken 3 days. So let's say you have your first day, Monday, you create a backup job and you push it out to a target bucket in Cloudian. Since you enabled the lock from Veeam, this particular backup data is locked. It's a 3-day window that is blocked for, so any incrementals that are coming, you will see it's locked on Monday, on Tuesday, on Wednesday, and then when you come to the new daily, which is on a Thursday, your locking on Monday will be released. Now, the way this is done is you can actually now go and clear out the backup copy on Monday to clear out space. You don't have to. It can be as long as years. It's just based on how your policies and how your retention will be set up that you can do it. Similarly, with any other backup vendor, you can do the same. Again, the policies will have to be set directly on Cloudian. And that's the way you would go ahead and protect your data from the threat of getting locked with ransomware. Hope this makes the presentation reasonably clear.
Okay, thanks.
Open up for questions.
Yes, no, thank you, Amit and Michael. So Amit and Michael, I will read off a few of these questions that have come in from the audience. The first question, how is the data protected from a rogue or disgruntled administrator?
Okay, I can take that. Hi, this is Amit. So I mentioned this briefly. Maybe I should get a little more detail. So Cloudian HyperStore, when we ship it in the worm mode, we have we actually block the root access as it goes in, along with Secure Shell enabled. The system is actually verified compliant for the non-rewritable and non-erasable storage requirements of SEC 17A4. Now, this has been done in a third-party government assessment by co-asset agents, co-asset associates. So you can actually rely on that information to say that if this particular worm-enabled mode is set, even if you have a disgruntled employee who had super user privilege, even if they still have their, let's say that employee is fired, but still has access for a few days, they will not be able to go and delete any of the data because you've thought about this and you've created the worm fence around your data that it makes it completely immutable, right? The certification that we actually did has gone through not just the feature set, but also the methodology that was used to create our storage system and our worm capabilities to make sure that there are no vulnerabilities that people can exploit and get around. Other solutions in these cases fail because the storage platforms are not as secure at the system level. So from that perspective, Cloudian HyperStore definitely can enable you to be protected against rogue and disabled employees as well. Sorry. Mike, you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that was fine. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Amit. Looks like we have another question here. Does worm storage deployed in this fashion help us with compliance?
So I'll take that one, if that's all right.
Sure.
The idea with compliance, and for whatever reason, no one ever puts it this way, but governance, what the organization wants to do, the mission, if you will, why we do these things, plus evidence, auditable, real-time, real fact, equals compliance. So governance plus evidence equals fact. And a lot of what Amit has been talking about is how do I do this thing so that I can recover from ransomware? It's a bit of how the sausage gets made. And from an executive point of view, that's fine. One of the reasons our clients come to us is that we can facilitate that for our clients. And so the idea is whatever your governance standard is, be it, and it's likely if this is on this call, it will likely be the NIST. Deploying your worm drive actually handles a big chunk of NIST SP 800-61, which is your incident handling guide. And so the meat of that guide, the biggest chunk of actions in incident response is something called containment, eradication, and recovery. If we have our backups configured in this way, if we practice their recovery, if we've got governance that dictates our actions, and if we can provide auditable evidence that we're meeting those governance standards. In other words, if I know what the heck I'm doing here, then you actually take a huge part of the NIST incident handling checklist and are immediately in compliance with it. And those all have SOC 2 or ISO 27001 components as well. So short answer, yes, this tackles a lot of your incident response and computer handling checklist from a compliance point of view.
So we have another question that.
I was
go ahead, Amit.
I'm sorry. No, that was a perfect answer. It's great to see that you guys actually have all of the bases covered as well. And from a services perspective, how do you guys see this as being offered from your side? Maybe we can touch on that as well, Mike.
Sure. Thank you. I mean, the idea here is that we are an organization that exists. We are a process organization, and we're a process organization that's applied to cybersecurity operations. And so what we want to do is make sure that the governing documents, governance of our clients, makes sense and is rational. We exist to operate to those standards and to provide evidence that we're doing it. And again, governance plus evidence equals compliance. It just so happens that through those first two activities, we get compliance as a collateral benefit. And so what we're looking to do is to get to organizations that don't have the time or the expertise or want another piece of electronics to take care of, but just want to have their posture handled in case ransomware hits. And so that's where we come in with Cloudian, as we create these systems and put them into production and manage them through time if our clients don't want to do it themselves. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Michael and Amit. We have another question that came in. Here's this question. Our organizations use tape for protection against ransomware. How is this solution you talked about different or better?
I'll take that from a storage perspective, right? Tapes have traditionally been the means for ransomware protection for some of the customers that we've talked with, right? It only works if the customer is actually keeping their backups up to date on tapes. And also, they also have to take care of the fact that tapes do get corrupted. They have to be checked from time to time to ensure that your data is actually being protected and is readily available in the case of an eventuality. The process to retrieve and check this data for the veracity is cumbersome, to say the least. In addition, the tape technology keeps getting updated ever so often, and by the time you are looking to retrieve your data or get out of a ransomware attack, your reader may be at a different version than what you had stored your data in the tape form. So LTFS keeps coming up with newer standards, and you need to recode your data as you go. So it's not just a one-time take a backup and it's done. You have to keep doing this on a regular basis. And of course, when in the case of an attack, retrieving from tape backups is time-consuming, it is manpower-consuming, and it may or may not work. You won't know it till you actually try it. So in that perspective, tape may not be the right solution. What Object Lock with Cloudian and the immutability feature set, what it does is it gives you the same or better data immutability with an always online backup. You can check the veracity of your data on an ongoing basis, and most of the time, if you factor in the cost for data retrieval, the data storage, this solution comes in at a better price point and a better TCO than you would have at a tape. So overall, similar kind of protection at a better overall result. Mike, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, it's sure you get the price point benefit, and that's great. I think that for me, the critical bit is the time to recovery and the actual usability of the information. I've seen complicated tape systems try to get backed up to production, and typically it's somebody who hasn't tried it for 3 to 5 years. Perhaps the employee in charge with backing up has never restored. And so the idea here is that tape is functionally unusable at this point. And so let's get something that we can actually succeed with. Let's get something that we can actually demonstrate to be effective, which is where the Cloudian comes in.
So with that, this concludes our Ransomware Are You Prepared for Tech and Takeout virtual event. Again, reach out to us at info@cloudian.com, and we'll be happy to address any other questions. And please be sure to check out our website at cloudian.com. Thank you for joining us today, and have a wonderful day.